Constance Garrett's voice cut through the frozen air like a blade meant to draw blood in public. "What is this?" she said, loud enough that the entire platform turned to look. She did not step forward to greet the woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry her son. She stepped back, as if the sight of Clara Whitmore and her 3 small children were something contagious. Her gloved hand came up, one finger extended, pointing at the twins clutching Clara's coat, and the little girl pressed against her hip. Thomas, you tell me right now. Did you know about this?" Thomas Garrett said nothing. He stood behind his mother like a man who had misplaced his spine somewhere between breakfast and this moment. Clara stood on the platform of Hollow Creek Station with the wind cutting through her thin dress and 3 4-year-old children shivering against her legs. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the train. She had imagined it going wrong in a dozen different ways. But she had not imagined this. A woman she had never met pointing at her children the way you point at livestock that arrived in the wrong pen. "She tricked you," Constance announced to no one and everyone at once. "She tricked this entire family. If you were standing in Clara's boots that day, if you had sold everything you owned, packed your children into a train car for 6 days, and arrived at the only door left open to you, what would you have done when that door slammed in your face in front of a crowd?" That question is the beginning of everything. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you believe that a person's worth is not decided by the worst moment of their life, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that frozen platform, because what happens next will stay with you. Clara Whitmore had not set out to deceive anyone. That was the thing that made the whole disaster so particular in its cruelty. She had written honest letters. She had said, in plain language, that she was a widow with children. She had described the twins, Owen and Eli, both 4 years old, mirror images of each other with their father's dark eyes and their mother's stubborn jaw. And she had described little May, the youngest by 11 minutes, who collected rocks and spoke to them like they were friends. Clara had written all of this down. She had assumed the letters arrived. She had assumed that a man who replied warmly, who described his ranch and his quiet life and his hope for company, had read what she sent and made his peace with it. She had been wrong about that, as it turned out. She was wrong about several things that December. The train from Cheyenne had been delayed twice by weather, and by the time it pulled into Hollow Creek, the children had been awake for most of 30 hours. Owen had developed a cough that rattled in his chest like loose gravel. Eli kept asking when they were going to the new house. May had stopped asking anything at all, which was in some ways more alarming, because May was not the kind of child who went quiet easily. Clara had told them, in the patient and slightly manufactured calm of a mother who is quietly terrified, that the new house was close, that they were almost there, that everything was going to be fine. She had believed it mostly, until she stepped off the train and saw the look on Thomas Garrett's face. He was not a bad-looking man. Mid-30s, square-jawed, the kind of rancher's build that came from genuine work rather than performance. But the look on his face when he saw the children, that flinch, that small but unmistakable recoil, told Clara everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. He had not read her letters, or he had read them and forgotten, or someone else had answered them on his behalf and simply omitted the parts that were complicated. She would never know which one was true. It stopped mattering very quickly. Constance Garrett was the kind of woman who had decided, somewhere in her 50s, that the world owed her a particular kind of order. She ran the Garrett household and a considerable portion of the Garrett family's social reputation with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped distinguishing between love and management. She had approved of the mail-order arrangement because a quiet, young, unencumbered woman would have been a useful addition to the household, someone who could produce grandchildren and cause no disruption. What arrived on that platform was the opposite of what she had ordered. "You have 3 children," Constance said, saying it the way you might say you have a contagious illness. 3. Did you think we would not notice? Did you think you could simply arrive and we would simply... She stopped herself, collected herself with visible effort, then spoke more quietly, which was somehow worse. "We are not running a charity house, Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Whitmore," Clara said. It came out before she had decided to say it. She had not planned to correct the woman. It was not a strategic choice. It was simply the reflex of someone who had buried a husband and did not intend to pretend otherwise. Constance Garrett's eyes went flat. "Mrs. Whitmore," she repeated. "Then you are a widow." "I wrote that in my letters. My son does not recall receiving any such information." Clara looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the platform boards beneath his boots. He was, she realized, a man who had spent his entire life standing one step behind his mother and had developed a permanent slight forward lean from it. "I have the copies," Clara said. "I kept copies of everything I sent." "That is very organized of you," Constance said, and made it sound like an accusation. "It does not change what is in front of us. 3 children, 4-year-olds, from the look of them." She said 4-year-olds the way you might say unpaid debts. "This is not what was arranged." Owen chose that moment to cough, a long, ragged sequence that bent him forward at the waist. Clara pulled him against her side automatically, rubbing his back, and in doing so she exposed May and Eli more fully to the wind. Both of them were shaking. Clara's coat was already unbuttoned, half open because she had been using the panels to shield the children during the walk from the train car. She was wearing a dress that had been her best 3 years ago and was now simply her only decent one. It showed at the seams. Robert Garrett, who had not spoken until this point, spoke now. He was older than Constance by 10 years or more, a man made of hard decisions and harder winters, and he had the rancher's habit of saying the maximum amount of damage in the minimum number of words. "Go back," he said. "Take the next train east. Whatever arrangement was made, it is unmade now." The platform crowd, which had been pretending very hard not to watch, stopped pretending. Clara felt the specific cold of being looked at by strangers when you are in the worst moment of your life. It is different from ordinary cold. It goes into places that weather cannot reach. She did not cry. She had decided, somewhere on the train, that she would not cry in front of her children if she could help it. May was already watching her with those careful, too-old eyes, and Clara knew that whatever expression she wore right now was the expression May would carry into her own adulthood as the memory of this day. So Clara kept her face still and her voice level, and she said, "I have nowhere to take them." "That," said Constance Garrett, pulling her gloves straighter, "is not our concern." And that was that. Thomas said nothing. He looked at Clara once, briefly, with something that might have been shame or might have been simple discomfort, and then he turned and followed his parents toward the wagon. The Garrett family's hired hand brought their vehicle around. The crowd dispersed, the way crowds do when the spectacle has resolved itself, and there is nothing left to watch that feels comfortable. Clara stood on the platform with one hand on Owen's back and one hand holding May's, with Eli pressed against her left leg, and she looked at the train that would leave in 40 minutes and understood that she had, in fact, no choice at all. There was no east to go back to. She had sold the furniture, settled the debts her husband left behind, and spent the last of what remained on train tickets and the gray wool dress she was standing in. Her sister in Philadelphia had made it clear, without saying so directly, that there was no room. The boarding house in Cheyenne, where she had spent 3 nights before this train, had taken the last of her travel money. She had $11 and some cents in her coat pocket. She had calculated several times what $11 and some cents could do for a woman with 3 4-year-olds in a Wyoming winter, and the answer was not enough, not nearly enough. She sat down on the platform bench. The station agent had gone inside, and the bench was the only thing available. And she put her arm around Owen and pulled the other two close, and she looked at the mountains to the west and tried to think. Eli said, "Mama, is that the new houseman?" "No," Clara said. "That was someone else." "Did he not want us?" Clara looked down at him. He was asking the question with genuine curiosity, not with grief, because he was 4 years old and had not yet learned that some questions should be delivered with softness. "He made a mistake," Clara said. "It happens." "Oh," said Eli, apparently satisfied, and went back to examining a crack in the platform boards. Owen coughed again. May pressed her face against Clara's arm and said nothing, and Clara held the back of the little girl's head with her palm and thought about the next 40 minutes with the particular focused desperation of a person who cannot afford to think about anything longer than that. She did not see Colton Ward until he was already standing about 15 feet away. He was not a large man in the way that seemed designed to be noticed. Medium height, rangy, with the kind of economy of movement that comes from years of physical work in cold climates. He had a hat that had been through considerable weather and a coat that was better quality than his hat, which suggested a man who made practical choices in a certain order. I was watching the Garrett's wagon disappear down the main road, and his expression was not readable in the way that most frontiermen's expressions were not readable. But there was something in his stillness that was different from the other bystanders' studied non-involvement. Clara was not paying him particular attention. She was doing the thing she always did when things were bad, which was making a list, in her head, ordered by urgency. The list was Owen's cough first, then warmth, then food, then the problem of the night, which she had not solved yet, and was doing her best not to look at directly, the way you avoid looking at a drop from a height, because looking at it makes it real. She took off her coat. It was not a dramatic gesture. She did it the way she did everything when she was in that mode. Efficiently, without ceremony, calculating that Owen's cough plus the temperature plus his thinness added up to more risk than her own discomfort. She wrapped the coat around all three children as best she could, which worked imperfectly because there were three of them in one coat, but it worked well enough. She was in her gray dress in a Wyoming December, and she sat up straight and did not shiver visibly because May was watching. That was when Colton Ward turned and looked at her directly for the first time. He looked at the coat situation. He looked at the children. He looked at Clara's face, which was composed in the way that faces are composed when composure is the only thing left that belongs to you. He looked away. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked over to the station agent's door, knocked on it, went inside, came back out with something, and crossed the platform toward her. He held out a blanket, the kind of rough wool blanket that stations kept for emergencies, without saying anything. Clara looked at it. She looked at him. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said. She took the blanket. She wrapped it around Owen and Eli, and she and May shared the coat, and for a few minutes nobody said anything at all. Then Colton sat down on the far end of the bench, at a distance that was respectful, and he said, "I saw what the Garretts did." "Most of the town did," Clara said. "Yeah." He turned his hat in his hands. "Robert Garrett does things in public so there's no argument about what happened. Make sure there are witnesses so nobody can say he was unfair." Clara looked at him. "That is not what fairness means." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She studied him for a moment. He had not introduced himself. He had not explained what he wanted. Most men who approached a woman in a difficult situation wanted to explain what they had to offer before they asked what they intended to ask. This man was just sitting there, turning his hat, apparently willing to let silence exist without filling it. It was, she thought, an unusual quality. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "Colton Ward." He nodded at the children. "Yours?" "All three." "The boy coughing. He been sick long?" "2 days. It's not serious yet, but it will be if he doesn't get inside somewhere warm." Colton nodded. He looked at the mountains again. Then he said, "Where are you planning to go?" "I'm working on that." "You've got the return train in." He looked at the position of the sun, the old habit of a man who didn't rely on a watch. "About 35 minutes." "I'm aware." "Anywhere to go back to?" Clara said nothing for long enough that he had his answer. He turned his hat one more time, and then he stopped turning it, and he said, "I have a ranch. Small one. 3 bars, 6 miles out. It's not much to look at, but it's got a working stove and a loft and food enough for winter." Clara went very still. "I'm not," he said, and then he stopped and started over because he was apparently the kind of man who chose his words carefully and rejected the first set that came to him. "I'm not offering anything except what I said. Roof, heat, food. You can stay through the worst of the winter and figure out your next step from a position that isn't a train platform in December." Clara looked at him. "You don't know me." "No." "You don't know anything about me." "I know you took your coat off and put it on your kids," he said. "I know you kept your face straight when a woman twice your age called you a charity case in front of half the town. I know you've got a sick kid and nowhere to sleep tonight, and that train behind you goes somewhere you've got nothing to go back to." He met her eyes and held them. "I'm not asking for anything back. I'm just telling you what I've got." Owen coughed again, and this time it went on for longer, and May made a small, frightened sound against Clara's arm that she tried to suppress and didn't quite manage. Clara looked at the three of them. She thought about $11 and some cents. She thought about the return train and what was at the end of it. She thought about the rule she had made herself after her husband died, that she would never again accept help from a stranger without knowing what that help was going to cost her. She thought about Owen's cough. "What do you get out of it?" she asked. Colton considered this. I was honest enough not to pretend the question was unreasonable. "My ranch is quiet," he said. "Too quiet most days. I haven't had company since my hired hand moved to Colorado in September." He paused. "That's not a good enough reason, I know, but it's the honest one." Clara looked at the train. She looked at her children. She looked at this man who had not smiled at her in the particular way that some men smiled at a woman in a desperate situation. The smile that meant they were calculating something. He was not calculating. He looked, if anything, slightly uncertain himself, as if he had made this offer before he finished thinking it through and was now committed to it. 6 miles, she said. I've got a wagon. The children need to eat before we go anywhere. Station diner is open. I have $11. I didn't ask you to pay for it. Clara pressed her lips together. It was not humility that made this hard. It was the specific difficulty of accepting help from a direction you hadn't prepared for, from a person whose motivations you couldn't fully calculate yet. She had learned in the last 3 years to be careful about accepting things. Things that were given freely had a way of becoming obligations later. Men who offered help to women alone had a way of deciding, eventually, what the terms of that help actually were. But Owen made that low, rattling sound in his chest again, and the wind came off the mountains, and Clara made her decision the way she made all her decisions, quickly, practically, and with full knowledge that she might be wrong. All right, she said, but I want to be clear about what I'm agreeing to. I'm accepting a warm place to stay while I figure out my situation. Nothing else. I'll work. I cook. I sew. I can manage a household. I'm not accepting charity. Colton nodded. Understood. And if at any point I decide to leave, we leave. Without argument. Understood. And if you do anything that makes me feel unsafe, Mrs. Whitmore. He said it quietly, but there was something in the way he said it that stopped her. Not an interruption, more like a door being held open. I understand what you're asking me to agree to, and I agree to it. Clara held his gaze for 3 full seconds. All right, she said again. Then I suppose we'd better get these children fed before we go anywhere. May looked up at Colton with the evaluating expression she normally reserved for rocks of uncertain quality. Do you have a dog? She asked. Colton looked down at her, and something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. I do, he said. Her name's Biscuit. May considered this. That's a funny name for a dog. She thinks it suits her. May appeared to accept this as reasonable and returned her attention to her rock. Clara stood up and adjusted the blanket around Owen and Eli, and she did not look at the train again. She had made her decision, and she was finished second-guessing it, because second-guessing cost time and energy, and she had run very low on both. She had not come this far to fall apart on a train platform. But as she gathered her suitcase and took Owen's hand and followed Colton Ward toward the station diner, she allowed herself one moment, just one, of something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but lived somewhere between the two. She was walking away from the last plan she'd had. She was walking toward something she couldn't see clearly yet. And the mountains to the west were enormous and indifferent, and the wind was cold enough to make your eyes water, and 3 4-year-old children trusted her completely, which was the most terrifying and clarifying thing she had ever known. She had $11. She had 3 children. She had made a decision based on a blanket and an honest answer and a man who hadn't smiled at her the wrong way. It was not much, but Clara Whitmore had built things out of less before, and she intended to build something out of this too. What that something would be, she could not yet say, but she was not getting back on that train. That much she knew. The station diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, which was exactly the kind of smell that meant warmth, and warmth was what mattered. Clara got the children settled into a corner booth with the efficiency of someone who had been managing 3 4-year-olds in public spaces for long enough to have developed a system. Owen got the window side because he needed less containment. Eli got the wall side because he needed more. May sat in the middle and arranged her 2 best rocks on the table in front of her like she was setting up a small office. Colton sat across from them and did not say anything about the rocks. The woman who ran the diner, broad-shouldered, somewhere past 60, with the expression of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them, brought coffee without being asked, and looked at the children with the neutral assessment of a person deciding whether they were going to be trouble. "What'll it be?" she said. "Whatever's hot," Colton said. "For all of them. Beans and cornbread. Got some salt pork left." "That'll do." The woman looked at Owen, who was still coughing intermittently, with the faint pinch of someone who runs a food establishment and is thinking about contagion. Clara noticed and said, "It's the cold. He's been on a train for 6 days. Once he's warmed up, he'll be fine." The woman looked at her for a moment, then at the coat situation, then at Colton, then back at Clara. She said nothing about any of it, which Clara appreciated, and went back behind the counter. Eli was looking at Colton with the open scrutiny that 4-year-olds apply to new people, which has no social filter and no mercy. "You have a big hat," Eli said. "It's a regular hat," Colton said. "It's big." "Eli," Clara said. "It is, though." Colton picked up his coffee cup and did not argue the point. Clara watched him do it and noticed that he was careful not to look at her children in the specific way that some adults looked at children they considered problems. The slightly averted gaze. The stiffness that said, "I am tolerating this." He wasn't performing comfort around them either. He just existed in the same space with them, the way a person does when other people's children don't particularly unsettle them. She filed that away without deciding what to do with it yet. The food came, and the children ate with the intensity of people who had been surviving on train car provisions for nearly a week. May ate with one hand and kept the other on her rocks. Owen's cough settled some as he got warm food into him. Eli ate half his beans and then started arranging the rest into patterns, which Clara redirected twice before giving up on the third attempt. Clara ate and did not taste anything and tried to think clearly. The thinking went like this. She had made a decision based on limited information about a man she had known for 40 minutes. The decision had a logic to it. Owen needed warmth. They needed a roof. The alternative was the train and a destination that didn't exist. But the logic of a decision made under pressure was not always the logic of a decision that held up over time. She needed to know more about what she had agreed to. She needed to understand the shape of the situation before she was 6 miles outside of town and dependent on a stranger. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. Colton looked up from his coffee. He seemed mildly surprised by the directness of it, though he covered that quickly. 8 years. Bought it from a man who ran cattle and decided he was done with Wyoming winters." "You run cattle?" "Some. Mostly horses now. I've got a contract with the Army remount program, supplying horses for the cavalry. It's steadier than cattle. Less loss in a bad winter." "And you manage it alone?" "My hired hand left in September, like I said. I've been managing it alone since." Clara looked at him. "Why didn't you find another hand?" "Tried. Men who want ranch work in this territory want wages I can't pay through the winter. Spring I'll hire again." He paused. "It's a small operation. 7 horses right now, plus the ones I'll start with in the spring. I can manage the feeding and the basic maintenance. It gets tight." "What's the house like?" He seemed to appreciate that she was asking practical questions rather than the kind of questions people asked when they were being polite. "Main room with the stove. 2 rooms off that. I use one. The other's storage. There's a loft. It's not finished. There's no wall on one side, but it's above the stove so it stays warm enough. The roof is sound." Clara did a quick calculation. "I'll take the storage room if we can clear it enough for the children. I don't need much space." "You can have the bedroom. I'll take the loft." "That's not Mrs. Whitmore." He said it with a particular kind of patience, not condescending, just steady. "I'm not going to have a woman and 3 small children sleeping in an unfinished loft. I'll take the loft. You take the room." Clara held his gaze for a moment. She had the impulse to argue on principle because she did not like being managed, even kindly, but she also recognized when an argument was worth having and when it wasn't, and this one wasn't. "Fine," she said. "But I meant what I said about working. I'll cook and clean and manage whatever the household needs. I'm not a guest." "I didn't take you for one." They drove out to the 3 Bars Ranch in a wagon that was cold and drafty and slightly better than the train, which was the most that could be said for it. Clara sat in the back with the children piled against her, the blanket from the station and her coat distributed between them, and she watched the landscape open up around them, flat and enormous and winter-stripped, the kind of country that made no apologies for what it was. May fell asleep almost immediately, which was unusual for her. Eli lasted longer, narrating a story about a rock family to no one in particular until that too faded out. Owen slept fitfully, coughing once or twice, but less than before. Clara held all three of them and felt the particular weariness of a person who has been strong for so long that the exhaustion has become structural, built into the way she held herself, the set of her jaw, the constant low hum of calculation running behind everything she did. She did not sleep. The Three Bars Ranch was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't quite known what she expected. It was small, a main house, a barn, a second outbuilding that was falling in on one side, set against a rise that broke some of the wind. The house itself was solid. Someone had built it to last, even if they hadn't gotten around to finishing it. There was a porch that needed 2 boards replaced, and a chimney that was already working, smoke rising from it in a pale column, which meant Colton had left a fire banked before he went to town. A dog appeared from around the side of the house as the wagon pulled in, medium-sized, yellow-brown, with the unhurried confidence of an animal that owned the property and was simply allowing humans to use it. This was, Clara surmised, Biscuit. May woke up when the wagon stopped, looked at the dog, and said, "That's her," with the certainty of someone meeting a person they'd already decided to like. Colton helped the children down from the wagon without making a production of it, and then he helped Clara down, and she took her hand back from his as soon as her feet were on the ground, not rudely, just promptly, and he noticed and didn't comment. Inside the house was warmer than the outside by a significant margin, which was the first genuinely good thing that had happened to Clara since she'd stepped off the train. The main room had a large iron stove, a table with 4 chairs that didn't match, a shelf of books that surprised her, and the general appearance of a space lived in by someone who was tidy out of habit rather than inclination. Everything had a place. Nothing was decorative. There was a coffee pot, a cast iron pan, a row of hooks by the door. Clara put the children down near the stove and started taking inventory. Colton watched her do it. "The pantry's through there," he said, nodding toward a door. "I laid in enough for winter before the prices went up in November. There's flour, dried beans, salt pork, some canned goods, root vegetables in the cellar." "Is the root cellar insulated?" "Well enough." "I'll want to look at Owen's cough tonight. Do you have any dried sage or eucalyptus?" "Sage, yes. I don't know what the other thing is." "Sage will do, and honey if you have it." "In the pantry." Clara nodded and went into the pantry. It was, as he'd said, well-stocked. More than well-stocked for one person. He had bought in quantity, which suggested either a man who planned ahead or a man who was lonely enough that he over-prepared for winters out of an excess of time. She looked at the shelves and made quick assessments and adjusted her estimate of the situation slightly upward. They were not going to starve. That was not nothing. She came back out, and Colton was crouched in front of the stove, adding wood, with Owen standing about 18 inches away from him, watching the process with focused interest. "The wood goes in the big hole?" Owen said. "That's right." "Why?" "That's where the fire is." "Where does the fire go?" "Up the chimney." "And then where?" Colton appeared to consider the full philosophical weight of this question. "Away," he said, which seemed to satisfy Owen, who thought about it and then nodded. Clara stood in the pantry doorway watching this exchange and felt something move through her chest that she could not immediately name. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than gratitude. The recognition that Owen had not had an adult man crouch down and talk to him as if his questions mattered in a very long time. Her husband had been dead for 2 years. The period before he died had not been easy for anyone in the house. There had been a gap, and children noticed gaps even when they couldn't name them. She went and made a sage tea for Owen and got all 3 children through the process of eating something more, washing faces with water heated on the stove, and settling into the bedroom which Colton had made up while she was managing the food. Not elaborately, just clean blankets pulled from a chest, a candle set on the windowsill. The gesture was practical and somehow, because of its practicality, more affecting than something more demonstrative would have been. She sat with the children until they slept, which took less time than usual because they were all past the point of having any reserves left. May fell asleep with one hand still curved around her best rock. Eli slept with his mouth open. Owen breathed more easily with the sage tea in him, his chest rising and falling with less effort than it had on the platform. Clara sat there for a while after they were all out, doing nothing, which was something she almost never allowed herself. Then she got up and went back to the main room. Colton was at the table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a ledger. I was not performing casualness. He was actually working, running figures with a pencil and a slight furrow between his brows that suggested the figures were not entirely cooperative. He looked up when she came in. "They're down?" he asked. "All three. Owen's breathing better." "Good." Clara poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down at the table, not across from him but at the corner, a position that was neither intimate nor distant, just practical. She wrapped both hands around the cup and said nothing for a moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set the pencil down. "The letters I sent to Thomas Garrett, I did write them. I told him I was a widow with 3 children. I told him they were 4 years old and that they came as part of the arrangement, or not at all." She looked at her coffee. "I don't know if he read them, or if his mother intercepted them, or if he read them and chose to forget. But I did not mislead anyone. I want you to know that because people in this town are going to say otherwise." Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." She looked up. "Constance Garrett's housekeeper is Agnes Morrison's daughter," he said. "Agnes Morrison runs the dry goods store in town. Information moves in this territory faster than weather does." He picked up the pencil again, turned it in his fingers. "I heard 2 weeks ago that Thomas Garrett's bride-to-be had written that she had children. I heard Constance decided that wasn't going to happen and had Thomas write back anyway without telling her the arrangement was off. I don't know if that's true." Clara felt the cold quality of this information settle into her. "She knew," Clara said. "I think so. I can't prove it. She brought me here knowing I had 3 children and then—" Clara stopped. She pressed her lips together. The anger that moved through her was not hot. It had gone past hot into something much quieter and more durable. "She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to control what happened," Colton said. "The humiliation was part of how she did it. If you'd gotten on the train quietly and gone, nobody would have questioned it. Everybody would have assumed the arrangement just didn't work out." He met her eyes. "She made it public because she wanted it to look like your fault. And now it does. To some people." Clara sat with that. She thought about the platform. She thought about the crowd watching. She thought about the stories that would be told in Hollow Creek this week, in the diner, in the dry goods store, in whatever passed for a social gathering in a Wyoming December. The woman who arrived with 3 children she hid. The woman the Garretts turned away. The woman who then left with Colton Ward, who was— What? What would they call Colton in those stories? "This is going to cause you trouble," she said. "Probably. The Garretts are the most powerful family in this territory, from what you said. They own 4 times the land I own, and they've got 2 men on the county board." He did not say it with particular alarm. He said it the way you state a piece of geography. "This is how the land lies." "Then why did you do it?" Clara said. "And I want the honest answer, not the one that sounds good." He looked at her for long enough that she understood he was actually thinking about it rather than reaching for a preformed response. "Because I watched you take your coat off and put it on those kids," he said finally. "And I've seen people do a lot of things in hard situations, and most of them don't do that. Most of them hold on to what they've got." He paused. "And because I've watched the Garretts do that kind of thing before, to people who had less ability to absorb it than I do, and I've stayed quiet about it, and I'm tired of being quiet about it." Clara looked at him. "That's 2 reasons," she said. "Yes. The first one is more flattering to me. The second one is more honest about my own situation." She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. More like the muscle memory of one, the ghost of an expression that hadn't had much cause to surface in a while. She put her coffee cup down. "All right," she said. "Then we understand each other." "I think so." "I'll start properly in the morning. What time do you get up?" "Before light?" "Then I'll be up before light." She stood. "The Garretts are going to come back," she said. "You know that. I know that. And when they do, we'll figure it out when they do," he said. "There's no point in solving a problem before it shows up. You've got enough to carry tonight." Clara looked at him one more time, this man who had handed her a blanket on a train platform and then upended his entire winter on the basis of it, and she thought about what it meant that the only person in Hollow Creek who had treated her like a person worth treating well was someone who stood to lose something for doing it. She said goodnight and went to bed, and she lay in the dark with her children breathing around her. And she made a list, because that was how she processed things, always. A list of what she owed, what she could offer, what the situation required, and how long she had before the Garretts made their next move. She did not know how long that would be. She suspected it would not be long. The first morning at the Three Bars came in gray and hard and cold, the way Wyoming mornings came in December, without sentiment or ceremony. Clara was up before Colton, which she had intended. She had the stove fed and coffee made and cornmeal on by the time she heard him moving in the loft above. He came down the ladder with his hair uncombed and his boots in his hand, which was the least composed she had seen him, and he looked at the coffee and the stove and then at her and said nothing for a moment. "You didn't have to," he started. "I said I'd work," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. He pulled his boots on. He drank his coffee, and she noticed he took it the same way she did, black, no ceremony. By the time the children were up, she had a routine established in her head. This was how she survived things. She built structures out of available materials, and she made herself believe in them until they became real. She assigned Owen and Eli the task of keeping the wood box next to the stove filled from the pile on the porch, which they executed with the chaotic enthusiasm of 4-year-olds who have been given a job and take it extremely seriously. May attached herself to Biscuit and conducted a careful program of rock showing, apparently introducing the dog to her collection on an individual basis. Clara cooked, cleaned, assessed every corner of the house, noted what was needed and what was surplus and what could be repurposed, and filed all of it. Colton worked outside most of the day. Horses needed feeding, the barn needed maintenance, there were fences to check before the next storm came through. He came in for the midday meal and ate quickly and went back out. I was not cold. He was just efficient in the way of a man who had learned to run on a schedule and keep personal observations for the evenings when there was time for them. But at dinner, when Eli knocked his plate off the table and it hit the floor and broke clean in half, and Eli burst into tears of genuine panic, not because of the plate, but because of the expression he assumed was coming, the expression he had learned in the months of his father's illness and decline, the expression of adults with no patience left. Colton just picked up the 2 halves of the plate and said, "We'll get another one," and that was all. Eli stopped crying. He looked at Colton with the particular suspicion of a child checking whether the reprimand was delayed rather than absent. Then he wiped his face on his sleeve and picked up the beans that had scattered on the floor, one by one, and put them in a pile on the table. Clara watched all of this and said nothing. That night, after the children were in bed, she sat at the table mending a shirt of Owen's that had torn at the elbow, and Colton came in from the last check on the horses and washed his hands at the basin and said, "The boy, Eli. I was scared when he broke the plate." "Yes. That kind of scared takes a while to learn." Clara pulled the needle through and didn't look up. "Their father was sick for most of the last year of his life," she said. "It made him impatient at the end. He wasn't a cruel man. He was in pain. But children don't distinguish between those things very well." Colton said nothing for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the plain kind of sorry. Not the performance of sympathy, but the actual acknowledgement of a hard fact. "It was 2 years ago," Clara said. "We manage." "You do more than manage." She looked up at that, caught off guard by it, and Colton seemed mildly surprised himself that he'd said it, as if the words had gotten out before he'd approved them. He went to the stove and poured his coffee and stood there with his back to her for a moment and said, "I ran into Frank Darby in the barn lot this afternoon. He's a neighbor about a mile east. He came to check on the fence line we share." "And?" "And he told me Robert Garrett stopped by the Darby place this morning." Clara set the mending down. "He told Frank that I had taken in a woman of questionable character who had made fraudulent representations to the Garrett family, and that any neighbor who associated with her was effectively declaring their position in a land dispute the Garretts were considering pursuing." He turned around. "Frank told him to get off his property. Frank doesn't like the Garretts and never has, partly because of an incident with a water easement 3 years back." He paused. "But not everyone in this territory is Frank Darby." Clara's hands were very still on the mending. "He's already moving. He's sending a message. He wants people to understand the cost before they make their choices." "And what does that cost look like for you, specifically?" Colton sat down. He did not look away from her when he answered, which she noticed and appreciated. The Army contract comes up for renewal in March. If Robert Garrett puts pressure on the right people at the fort, that contract could go to another supplier. Without that contract, he stopped. It would be a hard year. Clara looked at him. I should leave, she said. No. Colton. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her first name. They both noticed it. He pressed on. If I send you away because the Garretts are making noise, I'm telling them that all they have to do to run me is make noise. And if I'm the kind of man who does that, I'm going to spend the rest of my life being run by someone. So no, you're not leaving because of this. Clara studied him for a long moment. She was trying to determine, with the analytical portion of her brain that never quite shut down, whether what he was saying was principle or stubbornness, and whether there was actually a meaningful difference between the two. This is going to get worse before it resolves itself, she said. Most things do. I mean significantly worse. The Garretts are not the kind of people who send one warning. I know what kind of people they are. I'm saying this because I want you to go into it with full information, not because I'm asking for your permission or your protection. She held his gaze. I have been managed by people who meant well and people who didn't, and I have been surprised by the consequences in both cases. I don't want to be surprised by the consequences of this. Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you want to do about it? The question surprised her, which was itself a piece of information, that she hadn't expected to be asked what she wanted. I want to understand what options we have, she said. Legally, socially. I want to know if there are people in this town who would stand by us, or if Frank Darby is the exception. Agnes Morrison, Colton said. She runs the dry goods store. She's the one who told me about the letters. She doesn't like the Garretts either. She's had her own issues with them over the years. She knows things, and she talks to everyone. Then I need to go into town. The road gets dangerous in a storm. We've got weather coming in the next day or two. After the storm, then? He nodded. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not admiration, not assessment, something in between that had its own quality. You're already thinking about how to fight them, he said. I've been thinking about it since the platform, Clara said. She picked up the mending again. Running away is the last option, not the first. They sat in the quiet for a while, the stove settling, the wind coming against the windows, the sound of children breathing in the next room. Not a comfortable quiet exactly, because the situation was not comfortable, but a functional quiet, the kind that two people can share when they've agreed, without saying so directly, to face something together. Outside, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees before midnight. Inside, the stove held and the children slept, and Clara Whitmore sat at a table in a house that was not hers yet, and mended a small boy's torn shirt with the careful attention of someone who intends to need these things to last. She was not planning to run, she was planning to stay. And the Garrett family, for all their land and their money and their men on the county board, had made one significant miscalculation when they pointed at Clara Whitmore and her 3 children on that platform and called them a burden not worth keeping. They had assumed that a woman alone with no resources and nowhere to go would simply go. They had not considered what she would do if she found somewhere to stay. They would find out. The storm came in 2 days later, the way Colton said it would, and it stayed for 4. During those 4 days, Clara learned the shape of the 3 Bars Ranch, the way you learn the shape of something you intend to keep, not from a distance, not as an observer, but from the inside with your hands. She learned which floorboard near the stove creaked and which didn't. She learned that the pantry door swelled in wet weather and needed a firm pull to open. She learned that Colton's coffee pot had a chip in the spout that he'd wrapped with a strip of leather, and that he replaced that strip every few weeks with a quiet, methodical attention that said something about the kind of man he was. The kind who maintained things rather than replaced them, who fixed what could be fixed, and didn't mourn what couldn't. She also learned, over those 4 snowbound days, that 3 4-year-olds in a small house during a Wyoming blizzard tested the structural integrity of everyone's patience in ways that no frontier landscape could fully prepare you for. Owen's cough had mostly cleared, which was a relief. What replaced it was his energy, which had been suppressed by illness and train travel and the accumulated stress of the platform and the wagon ride and the new place, and which now returned in full, concentrated form, requiring an outlet that the main room of the 3 Bars Ranch was not entirely equipped to provide. Eli had discovered that you could make a fairly satisfying sound by running the length of the room and sliding on the boards near the stove. May had stopped speaking to anyone except Biscuit and her rocks, which Clara recognized as May's method of processing change. She went inward and quiet and strange for a few days whenever the world shifted significantly. And then she came back, usually with an opinion she'd been forming in the interim. Colton managed all of this with the composure of a man who was genuinely surprised by it, but was not going to admit that. On the third evening, with the wind working hard against the north wall, and all three children finally asleep, Clara found him at the table with the ledger again, and she looked at his face and recognized the expression. Not worry exactly, but the particular quality of concentration that meant the numbers were not cooperating. "Can I look?" she said. He glanced up. "At the ledger?" "You've been staring at the same page for an hour." He hesitated. Not from distrust, she thought, but from the specific reluctance of a man who had been managing his own problems alone long enough that showing them to someone felt like a different kind of vulnerability than he was used to. But he turned the ledger so she could see it. Clara sat down and read. She was not a stranger to ledgers. Her husband had been a bookkeeper before the illness, and she had managed the household accounts for the last 2 years of his life when he couldn't. And she had an eye for where numbers were lying to you versus where they were simply telling you something you didn't want to hear. These numbers were telling the truth. It was not comfortable. The Army contract was the spine of the operation. Without it, the ranch could sustain itself through spring on the cattle revenue, barely, but there would be nothing left for the horse breeding program that was supposed to make next year solvent. The horses Colton had were good. She could see that from the figures, from the prices the Army was paying, but good horses required investment, and investment required cash that was currently very thin. "If the Garretts kill the contract," she said, "then I have until late spring before the situation becomes serious," he said, "and they could do it. If they get the right ear at the fort, they've done it before to other people." He took the ledger back. "There's a man at the fort, Captain Aldridge, who handles the procurement contracts. He's not a Garrett man, but he responds to pressure the same way most people do, which is by looking for the path of least resistance." Clara sat back in her chair and thought, what does the contract actually require? The specifications? 20 horses by April 1st, quarter horses, specific height and build requirements, sound and wind and limb. I've got 7 that already qualify. I need 13 more, which means winter breeding and hoping the spring foals are what I need, which they will be if the mares cooperate and the stallion doesn't have another opinion about it. "Could you deliver early, before the Garretts have time to move on the contract?" Colton looked at her. "What do you mean?" "If the Army has already received and inspected horses that meet the contract specifications, it becomes significantly harder to cancel the arrangement. A contract in the process of being fulfilled is a different thing from a contract that hasn't started yet." She had learned this from her husband, who had spent years working with supply contracts and had a particular phrase for it. Possession is 9/10 of the agreement. Colton was quiet for a moment. "I'd need the foals from February, which means the mares need to be at their best condition through the winter. Feed costs go up." "What's the alternative?" "Wait and hope Robert Garrett doesn't move as fast as he usually does." "You just told me he was at Frank Darby's place the morning after we arrived." "Yes." "Then he moves fast." Colton turned the pencil in his fingers. He was doing math in his head. She could see it in his eyes, the way people looked when they were running figures against variables. "If I could get 10 horses to the fort by mid-February instead of waiting for April, and Aldridge inspects and accepts them, the contract is essentially halfway executed." He paused. "It's possible. It's tight, but it's possible." "Then we should work toward possible," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression again, the one she was starting to recognize as the one he wore when something surprised him and he was processing it. Then he said, "You said we." "I did." "You've been here 4 days. I'm aware of how long I've been here." She did not look away. "I told you I wasn't going to be a guest. I meant it. If there's a problem with this ranch, it's a problem that affects me and my children as much as it affects you. So it becomes a problem I help think about." Colton looked at the ledger for a moment, then back at her. Then he said quietly, "All right." The storm broke on the 4th day, and the following morning Clara hitched herself onto the wagon seat next to Colton, and they drove into Hollow Creek together, which she understood would be noticed and interpreted by everyone who saw it. She had decided that was acceptable. She was not going to conduct herself like someone who had something to hide, because she didn't. Agnes Morrison's dry goods store was on the main street, between the post office and a feed merchant, and it was the kind of establishment that managed to be simultaneously a commercial operation and the primary social and informational hub of the territory. Agnes herself was somewhere in her mid-60s, short and wide through the shoulders, with white hair pulled back with a practicality that suggested she had long since stopped caring what it looked like and was simply keeping it out of her face. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and had the particular alertness of a woman who processed every piece of information that came through her door and filed it in a mental archive of extraordinary comprehensiveness. She looked at Clara when she walked in, the way that people look at someone they've already formed an opinion about and are now checking the opinion against the actual person. "You're the Whitmore woman," she said. "Clara," Clara said. "Yes." "Sit down," Agnes said, and it was not a question. She looked at Colton. "Coffee's on the back stove. You know where it is." Colton went and got the coffee while Agnes locked the front door. It was early enough that no other customers had arrived, and sat down across from Clara with the settled authority of a woman who owned the furniture she was sitting in. "You want to know about the letters," Agnes said. "I want to know what you know," Clara said. "All of it." Agnes looked at her for a moment. "You're direct," she said, in a tone that was neither criticism nor compliment, but genuine observation. "I don't have time not to be." Agnes nodded, once, as if this satisfied some criterion she'd been applying. "What I know is this. Your letters arrived, all 3 of them. I know because my daughter Vera handles the post that goes in and out of the Garrett household. She's been their housekeeper for 8 years. Your first letter arrived in October, and Vera saw Constance Garrett open it and read it before she gave it to Thomas. That is not an unusual thing in that household. Constance reads everything that comes in. What is unusual is that Vera saw Constance set that letter in the kitchen stove. Not give it to Thomas, burn it. Clara heard this and felt the cold, particular clarity of a thing being confirmed rather than revealed. She burned it. The second and third letters as well, Vera believes, though she only saw the first one directly. Agnes pushed her glasses up. Thomas wrote his replies based on what his mother told him you'd written. He was corresponding, in effect, with a woman his mother had invented. A young woman, no children, from a decent family fallen on modest hard times. That is who Thomas Garrett thought he was marrying. Clara looked at her coffee. And Thomas knew nothing about the actual letters. Vera believes he did not. Thomas is not a man of great initiative or perception, but he is not, as far as I know, deliberately cruel. Agnes paused. Constance, on the other hand, is a woman of considerable initiative and extremely specific ideas about what belongs in her family and what does not. Why would she do it that way? Clara said. If she didn't want me, she could simply have written back and said the arrangement was terminated. Because then Thomas would have known she was interfering, Agnes said. If she burns the letters and proceeds as if they contain different information, Thomas has no reason to question anything. He corresponds with the woman his mother describes. The woman arrives. The woman has children. Thomas is shocked. The arrangement falls apart. And it falls apart because of the woman's deception, not Constance's. She folded her hands on the table. It makes Constance entirely clean, and it makes you entirely culpable. The story the Garretts are telling in this town is that you are a dishonest woman who deliberately concealed 3 children from a decent family, and who has now transferred her designs to Colton Ward, who is too stubborn to see he's being manipulated. The silence that followed this was very quiet. Colton said from where he was standing by the stove, "We need the letters." Both women looked at him. "Clara said she kept copies," he said, "and Agnes just told us the originals were destroyed. If we have the copies and can show that they contain information the Garretts claim was never provided, it doesn't prove the originals were destroyed," Agnes said. "It proves she wrote them. It establishes that the information existed in writing. If the Garretts claim she hid it, we can show she committed it to paper." He set his coffee cup down. "It's not a courtroom, but it's enough to give people a different story to consider." Agnes looked at Clara. "Do you have the copies?" "In my suitcase," Clara said. "I have copies of all 3 letters." Agnes was quiet for a moment. She looked at Colton, then back at Clara, with the expression of someone running a calculation. There's a town meeting in 3 weeks, she said. First one of the new year. Everyone comes. It's how we handle the road maintenance budget mostly, but it's also where the county's business gets discussed before it goes to the board. She paused. Robert Garrett sits on that board. So does Dale Hicks, who does whatever Robert tells him to do. But there are 3 other board members, and 2 of them are men I've known for 20 years who are tired of the way the Garretts run this territory. You're suggesting we bring the letters to the meeting, Clara said. I'm suggesting that the meeting is an opportunity. What you do with it is your business. Agnes stood up. I'll tell you something else, though. Vera will not testify against the Garretts publicly. She's got children of her own, and that job is the only income she has. I'm not going to ask her to sacrifice herself. But she told me what she saw, and I am telling you, and I am not afraid of the Garretts in the way that some people are, because I am 64 years old, and I own this building free and clear, and they need what I sell more than I need what they pay. She looked at Clara steadily. You are not the first woman this family has treated this way. You are just the first one who didn't get on the train. They drove back to the ranch in a silence that was different from the silences they'd been sharing. Fuller, somehow, with things that hadn't been decided yet but were moving toward being decided. It was Colton who spoke first. The town meeting, he said. 3 weeks is enough time to prepare, Clara said. Prepare what exactly? A clear account of what happened, with the copies of the letters as evidence. And if Agnes is willing to say publicly what she just told us, she's willing, Colton said. Agnes doesn't say things she doesn't mean to follow through on. Clara nodded. She was looking at the road ahead, at the white flat distances of the Wyoming winter. The Garretts are going to find out we went to see Agnes, she said. This territory runs on information. They'll know by tonight. Probably. Then they'll move before the meeting if they can. She thought about Robert Garrett's face on the platform. The particular quality of his certainty. He was not a man who waited for problems to come to him. He managed them in advance. What does moving look like for them? Before a town meeting, what can they actually do? Colton was quiet for a moment. They can make life harder for my neighbors, put pressure on people not to trade with me. There's a supply merchant in town, Henderson, who sells feed on credit to most of the small ranches around here, including me. If Robert Garrett tells Henderson to cut off my credit, can he do that? Robert Garrett holds the note on Henderson's building, Colton said. He can do a lot of things. Clara processed this. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the horses and the February delivery and the army contract. She thought about the shape of a trap, which was something she'd become familiar with over the last few years. The way people who had more power than you used that power, not in obvious confrontation, but in the gradual closing off of options. You didn't see the walls going up. You just woke up one morning and found you had less room than you'd had before. Then we need to move first, she said. Colton glanced at her. The feed merchant, she said. How much do I need to pay Henderson directly, not on credit, to secure enough feed to get the mares through until the foals come? Cash, up front, before the Garretts can tell him anything. Colton stared at the road for a moment. You have $11. I had $11 when I got off the train, she said. I've been thinking about what I could contribute that has actual monetary value. I sew. I can alter and repair clothing to a professional standard. I did it in Philadelphia for 3 years to supplement what my husband made. If Agnes will let me put a notice in the store, I can take in work from town. That takes time to build up. Everything takes time to build up. The question is whether we start now or wait until the Garretts have already closed the options. She turned to look at him directly. I know this is your ranch and your decision. I'm not trying to run it. But you let me help think about it, and I'm thinking about it. And what I think is that we cannot afford to play defense. Defense is for people who have room to absorb losses. We don't. Colton drove for a while without saying anything. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold air. The sound of the wagon on the packed snow was the only sound. All right, he said finally. We go to Henderson tomorrow. Cash for the feed. How much do we need? They talked numbers for the rest of the drive home. The trouble came 9 days later, faster than Clara had expected, and in a form she hadn't fully anticipated. She was in the yard, hanging laundry in the thin winter sunlight. It was cold enough that the sheets would freeze stiff before they dried, but the sun and wind would still pull the moisture out if you left them long enough. And she had learned not to waste a clear day. When she heard the sound of horses coming down the road from town. Not one horse. Several. She finished pinning the sheet she had in her hands because she had decided some time ago that she was not going to drop whatever she was doing every time something alarming happened, because alarming things had been happening to her for 3 years, and she could not afford to be perpetually interrupted by them. Then she turned and looked. There were 4 horses. 3 men she didn't recognize, and James Garrett, who she recognized because he was built like his father, but with 20 years less weathering, broad through the chest, with the specific arrogance of a man who had inherited power rather than earned it and had never had reason to question the arrangement. He was not Robert Garrett. Robert Garrett was controlled. James was something blunter. He pulled his horse up about 30 feet from where she was standing and looked at her with the look of a man who had decided in advance what kind of person she was and was simply confirming his diagnosis. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "I'll keep this short." He didn't dismount, which was a deliberate choice. Staying on horseback kept the height advantage and made the conversation feel like an issuance rather than an exchange. "My family is prepared to offer you $50 and a train ticket to Cheyenne. You take the children and go, and we consider this entire situation resolved." Clara looked at him. "And if I decline?" "Then things get harder," he said, "for you and for Ward." "Things are already hard," Clara said. "That's not a deterrent." James Garrett's jaw tightened. He'd expected, what, gratitude, fear? He'd gotten neither, and men like James Garrett did not respond well to their expectations being disappointed. "You're not in a position to be difficult, Mrs. Whitmore." "I'm not being difficult," she said. "I'm being clear. I'm not going to leave because your family is offering money and calling it generosity when it's actually just a cheaper version of the problem you already created. Your mother brought me here under false pretenses. I have the letters to prove it. That is not a position I'm inclined to walk away from for $50. One of the men behind James shifted in his saddle. James himself went very still in the way that some men went still when they were deciding between 2 responses and choosing the worst one. "Ward can't protect you," he said. "He barely has a ranch left to protect. By the time my father is done, the Army contract will be someone else's. The credit at Henderson's will be gone. And every neighbor in this territory will know the cost of associating with—" "With what?" Clara said. "Say it plainly, Mr. Garrett. What is it that I am, exactly, that makes your family so determined to remove me?" He didn't say it. He pulled his horse around, and the men with him followed, and they rode back the way they'd come without another word. Clara stood in the yard and watched them go. Her hands were entirely steady. Her heart was not, but her hands were, and the hands were the part that showed. Colton had seen the riders from the barn. He came out when they were gone and walked across the yard and stopped next to her, and looked at the road where the dust was still settling and said, "What did he offer?" $50 and a train ticket." "And?" "And I told him no." Colton was quiet for a moment. He looked at the road and then at her. "Clara." "Don't," she said. "I'm not going to tell you to go." "Good." "I'm going to tell you that James Garrett is not his father," he said. "Robert calculates. James gets angry. An angry man with that much backing does things that a calculating man wouldn't. I know. We need to move up the timeline on everything." He looked back at the barn. "I'm going to go to the fort myself. Not wait for a letter, not go through the normal process. I'm going to ride out there and talk to Aldridge directly and ask for an early inspection date." "When?" "Tomorrow, if the road is passable." He paused. "It'll take 2 days. You'll be here alone with the children." Clara thought about James Garrett's face. She thought about the 3 men behind him who had not said anything and whose silence had been its own kind of statement. "Frank Darby," she said, Can he watch the road?" "I'll ask him tonight." They stood there for a moment in the cold, thin sunlight, in the yard of a ranch that was smaller than the Garrett family's ambitions and larger than anything Clara had expected to find herself defending 3 weeks ago. Eli appeared at the door of the house and shouted something unintelligible about biscuit and a rock and an injustice of unclear nature. May's voice, from inside, delivered what sounded like a judicial opinion on the matter. Owen appeared behind Eli, looked at Clara, and asked if it was almost supper time. "Almost," Clara called back. "How almost?" "Go inside and I'll tell you." He went. She turned back to look at the road one more time, And then she went inside too because supper needed making and children needed feeding, and the list of things required kept going, regardless of what the Garrett family decided to do about any of it. Colton rode to the fort the next morning before light. Clara was up to see him off, which she had not planned to announce, but which happened automatically, the way some things did when you shared a house with someone, and the house was small and the situation was serious. He stood at the door with his coat on and his weather-beaten hat and said, "There's a rifle in the storage room, top shelf, wrapped in canvas, loaded." "I know how to use a rifle," she said. He looked at her. "I know you do," he said, and she understood from the way he said it that he wasn't telling her about the rifle because he doubted her. He was telling her because he wanted her to know that he'd thought about it, that he'd considered her safety specifically, that she was not an afterthought in his planning. "Be careful on the road," she said. "It iced overnight." "I'll take it slow." He went. She stood at the door and listened to the horse's hooves fade into the dark, and then she closed the door and stood in the main room for a moment, and felt the specific quality of a house where there is only yourself and 3 sleeping children and a dog and the sound of wind and responsibility. Then she got the stove going and started the morning. She kept the children close to the house that day. She told them they were going to help her make bread, which Owen and Eli received as excellent news, and May received with the faint suspicion of a child who knew bread making was sometimes deployed as a distraction. They made bread. They made a mess of it. The bread came out lopsided, and one loaf had what appeared to be a thumb-sized depression in the top from Eli's investigation of whether the dough was ready. Clara put it in the oven anyway. Frank Darby came by at midday, a tall, leathery man with a daughter about the age of the twins and the unhurried manner of someone who had made peace with the pace of frontier life. He drank coffee and said he'd had a hand watching the road since morning, and that nobody had come through from the Garrett direction, and that he intended to keep it that way. "You're not worried about them coming after your operation too?" Clara asked. Frank looked at his coffee. "They already tried," he said. 3 years ago, with the water easement I mentioned to Colton. They got what they wanted then because I didn't fight hard enough." He looked up. "I've been regretting it since. Sometimes you get a second chance to make the right call." On the second afternoon, with Colton still not back and the light going early the way it did in Wyoming winter, Clara was sitting at the table going over the copies of her letters one more time. Not because she'd forgotten what they said, but because she was thinking about how to present them at the town meeting, how to make 3 sheets of copied paper do the work of undoing a story that had already had 3 weeks to take root in a small territory, when she heard hooves on the road. She was at the window before she'd decided to move. It was Colton, alone, coming at a careful pace because the road was iced and the horse knew it. She had the door open before he dismounted, and he looked up at her from the yard and said, "He'll do the inspection on February 10th. Clara let out a breath. "That's early enough?" "Early enough." He tied the horse. Aldridge was amenable, more than amenable, actually. He told me off the record that he'd heard Robert Garrett had been asking questions about procurement contracts and that it made him uncomfortable because he doesn't like it when civilians try to interfere with military supply chains. He came inside and went straight to the stove. He also said that a contract in active fulfillment is essentially untouchable by outside pressure. His words. Clara closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment, processing. "You should know," Colton said, pouring coffee, "that I talked to him for a while. About the ranch, about the horses, about the situation here." He turned around. "I told him you'd been helping me think through the delivery timeline." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because it's true. And because when a man from a small ranch comes to a military fort and says he can deliver 20 sound horses 2 months ahead of schedule, the man at the fort is going to ask why he's confident about that. And the honest answer involves you." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. "He asked if you were my wife," Colton said. The room was very quiet. "And what did you tell him?" Clara said. "I told him the situation was complicated," Colton said. "Which it is." He set his coffee cup down. "I'm not telling you that to make a point or to push anything. I'm telling you because I told you I would be honest with you about what I said and did while I was gone, and that was part of it." Clara looked at him. This man who had ridden 2 days to a military fort and back on iced roads, and had told the truth about her to a man who could affect his livelihood. She thought about the shape of honesty and what it cost when it would have been easier to just say, "Housekeeper" or "Widow, I'm helping," and move on. The town meeting is in 11 days, she said finally. Yes. The letters are ready. Agnes has agreed to speak. She paused. And you have a February inspection date. Yes. Then we're ahead of where I thought we'd be, she said. She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands and said, very quietly, thank you for going. He nodded. He didn't make anything of it. Outside, Owen had escaped from the house at some point in the last 5 minutes. She registered the bang of the door now, retroactively, and was currently standing in the yard explaining something to Biscuit with great seriousness and arm gestures. May was watching from the doorway in her coat and one boot, the other boot apparently a project she hadn't finished before abandoning it. Eli's voice was coming from somewhere in the house, demanding to know where Owen had gone. The Three Bars Ranch was not a peaceful place, exactly. It was too small and too pressed upon, and too full of children, and cold weather, and problems that hadn't been solved yet. But Clara stood at the window of it, and looked at the yard and the barn, and the road that Frank Darby had a man watching, and she thought about 11 days and letters, and a town meeting, and a February inspection. And she thought that the Garretts had made their move and she and Colton had made theirs. And what happened next would depend on which story the people of Hollow Creek decided to believe. She intended to give them every reason to believe the right one. The 11 days before the town meeting were the kind of days that showed you what you were actually made of, as opposed to what you believed yourself to be made of when things were easier. Clara had always thought of herself as a practical woman. She'd had to be. The years with Daniel had required it. The slow erosion of their savings as his health declined. The constant recalculation of what was possible versus what was necessary. The management of 3 children through a period of sustained uncertainty. The children were not equipped to understand but absorbed anyway. The way they absorbed everything, in their bodies and their sleep, and the way they startled at sudden sounds. Practicality had been her survival mechanism and her identity for so long that she had stopped distinguishing between the two. But these 11 days asked something different of her, and she recognized it for what it was, building something while a crisis was still in progress. You couldn't wait for the ground to stop shaking. You had to build on it anyway and trust that what you made would hold. She took in 3 sewing commissions in the first week, sourced through Agnes's store by word of mouth that moved faster than Clara had expected. A widow named Ruth Calloway needed a winter dress let out at the seams. A young woman who had recently gotten married needed her mother's wedding dress altered to fit. A rancher's wife, Margaret Hale, had a pile of her husband's work shirts that needed patching and reinforcement in the shoulders. None of it was elegant work. All of it was skilled work, and Clara did it at the table in the evenings after the children were down, with the lamp turned up as high as it would go, her needle moving in the steady rhythm she'd developed years ago when sewing had been the difference between eating and not eating. Colton watched this without commenting on it, which was his way. But she noticed after the 3rd evening that the lamp was always full of oil when she sat down, even when she knew she hadn't filled it herself that day. The horses were his equivalent. He was in the barn before first light every morning, working the mares through their winter conditioning. Not dramatically, not with any visible urgency, just with the systematic attention of a man who understood that the only way to get horses to the Army inspection in sound condition was to do the right things every day, including the days when he was tired and the wind was bad and nothing was cooperating. Owen had started following him to the barn. This had begun on the 6th day when Owen woke before Clara and was standing at the barn door in his coat and boots, which he had put on himself incompletely with 2 buttons in the wrong buttonholes. By the time Colton came out of the house, Colton had looked at him. Owen had looked at the barn. Neither of them said much. Colton had held the barn door open, and Owen had gone in, and that was how it started. Clara watched this development the way she watched all developments involving her children, with careful, calibrated attention, alert to both the good and the potential for harm. She had not brought her children here to attach them to a situation that might dissolve. She was aware that Owen was 7 months from turning 5, and had had very little consistent male presence in his life for most of the last 2 years, and that the barn and the horses, and a man who gave him small tasks and answered his questions without condescension were exactly the combination most likely to take root in a 4-year-old boy with his particular temperament. She was aware of what it would cost him if this didn't last. She did not tell Colton to stop, because what Colton was doing for Owen was real, and denying real things to children because you were afraid of later was its own kind of harm. What she did instead was make a note of it in the part of her mind where she kept the things that required eventual reckoning and she let it be. The town meeting was on a Thursday. They drove in the night before and stayed at a boarding house that Agnes had arranged. 2 rooms, reasonable rate, the proprietor a woman named Mrs. Fells, who had her own history with the Garrett family, involving a disputed fence line, and had decided her position accordingly. The children were difficult that evening, which was not surprising. They had been in the ranch house for weeks, and the boarding house was stimulating and strange, and May had found a cat in the hallway and was conducting an introductory interview with it that was going to end badly for everyone if the cat's patience ran out. And Eli had discovered that the floors in the boarding house were significantly more slidable than the floors at the ranch, which was information he could not resist applying empirically. Clara managed all of this and got them fed and in bed and sat down on the edge of the bed in her room after and felt, very completely, the weight of the next day. She had the letters in her bag. 3 copies, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture. She had read them so many times in the last 11 days that she could have written them out from memory, which was useful only in that it meant she knew exactly what they said and could not be caught off guard by any of it. Agnes had told her, in their most recent conversation, that the board members she'd spoken to were prepared to hear the matter formally. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerably more than Clara had hoped for 2 weeks ago. She knocked on the wall between her room and Colton's. They had established this as a signal, and he knocked back, which meant he was awake and had heard the children settle. She was not sure when this system had developed. It had simply appeared one evening at the ranch, organically, the way functional arrangements between people who share a space tend to develop when those people are paying attention to each other. She did not think about what that meant. She was saving that for after tomorrow. The town meeting was held in the main hall above the feed merchant's warehouse, a space that was large enough for the population of Hollow Creek and the surrounding ranches when they were all in it, which was not frequently. Clara and Colton arrived to find it already 3/4 full, which told her that the word had gotten around about what this meeting was likely to cover, and that people had opinions about it, and that their opinions were various enough that they wanted to be present for the outcome. Robert Garrett was already there. He sat at the front right side with James beside him and Thomas slightly behind, and 2 other men Clara didn't recognize who had the specific appearance of attorneys or men who worked adjacent to attorneys. Constance was not present, which Clara found interesting. Constance, who had engineered the whole situation, was not here to witness its public examination. Clara filed that detail. Agnes Morrison was near the front on the left, with Frank Darby beside her and Margaret Hale and her husband behind them. Several other faces Clara had come to recognize from town. Ruth Calloway, the young married woman whose name was Jessie Adler, the station agent from the train platform, were distributed around the room. Clara sat down next to Agnes. Colton sat on her other side. The room had the particular quality of a space where a lot of people were pretending to talk to each other while actually monitoring a different situation entirely. The meeting began with road maintenance because it always did. It took 20 minutes. Clara sat through it with the outward patience of a woman who had learned to wait for the thing she was waiting for without showing that she was waiting. Colton sat next to her without fidgeting, which she had come to understand was not equanimity so much as a trained stillness. He was not calm inside. He was simply very practiced at not showing the inside. When the road maintenance was concluded, one of the board members, an older man named Walter Pruitt, who Agnes had identified as one of the 2 who were tired of the Garretts, cleared his throat and said that there was a matter that several community members had asked to have addressed publicly, regarding the circumstances of a recent situation involving the Garrett family and a visitor to the territory. Robert Garrett did not look surprised. He had known this was coming. He sat with his hands folded and his face arranged in the expression of a man submitting to an inconvenience with dignified patience. "Mrs. Whitmore," Walter Pruitt said, "I understand you have something you'd like to present to the board." Clara stood. She did not look at the Garretts. She looked at the room, at the faces turned toward her, some curious, some hostile, some carefully neutral. She had spent 11 days thinking about this moment, and she had reached a conclusion about how to approach it, which was, simply, not with emotion, not with argument, not with the performance of injury, simply with facts, in order, and let the facts do the work. "I came to Hollow Creek in December," she said, "as a mail-order bride, having corresponded over 3 months with the Garrett family about an arrangement for marriage with Thomas Garrett. In those letters, I stated clearly and repeatedly that I was a widow with 3 children. I was told that my letters were received and the arrangement was confirmed. When I arrived, I was told that no such information had been provided, and I was publicly accused of deception. She opened her bag and took out the letters. These are copies I kept of everything I sent, she said. The originals were destroyed before they could be read by Thomas Garrett. I have a witness who saw the first original letter opened and burned by Constance Garrett before it was delivered to her son. The room shifted. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no outbreak, just a slight collective change in posture that meant people were paying a different kind of attention than they had been. Robert Garrett said, "This is a serious accusation." "Yes," Clara said. "It is." "And the witness," said Walter Pruitt. "The witness is not able to come forward publicly," Agnes said from her seat, in a voice that carried without effort. "The reason for that will be apparent to anyone who understands the employment situation in this territory." She paused. "I am prepared to state, under whatever oath this board considers appropriate, that the witness exists, that I have spoken with her directly, and that her account is consistent and specific." The second sympathetic board member, a man named Henry Cross, younger than Pruitt, who ran a small cattle operation east of Frank Darby's land, leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, you said the letters made clear you had 3 children. Could you read the relevant passages to the board?" Clara had not expected this to go so cleanly. Nothing ever went so cleanly. She was waiting for the interruption, for Robert Garrett's attorneys to raise some procedural objection, for someone in the room to shout something that derailed the proceeding. What she had not anticipated was Thomas Garrett. Thomas, who had said nothing on the platform, who had said nothing in the weeks since, who had been a peripheral and passive presence in every account of this situation, stood up. His father turned to look at him with an expression that Clara, from 20 feet away, could read clearly. "Sit down." Thomas did not sit down. "I want to say something," he said, to the room rather than to his father, which appeared to cost him something. The room waited. "I did not know about the children," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I was not part of any decision to handle the correspondence the way it was handled. I wrote to a woman my mother described to me, and the woman who arrived was not that woman, and I was—" He stopped. He ran a hand over his jaw. "I was told afterward that the discrepancy was Mrs. Whitmore's fault. I accepted that because it was easier than asking the questions I should have asked." He looked at Robert Garrett briefly and looked away. "I am not going to stand here and pretend that the way we treated that woman and those children on the platform was something I feel good about. Because I don't." The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence from the one before it. Heavier, with more going on underneath it. Robert Garrett's face had done something complex and brief that he'd controlled before it fully formed. James Garrett's jaw was set so hard it was visible from across the room. Clara looked at Thomas Garrett and thought about what it cost to do what he'd just done in a room full of people while your father was sitting 4 feet away. She did not revise her opinion of him entirely. He had still stood on that platform and said nothing while his mother dismantled her life in public, but she adjusted it. Walter Pruitt said, "Mr. Garrett, Robert Garrett, does the family have a response?" Robert Garrett stood. He was, Clara thought, genuinely formidable in a way that James was not. There was an intelligence behind it, a control, that made him more dangerous than blunter men. "The board has heard an account from a woman who had a financial incentive to misrepresent her situation, supported by copies of documents that cannot be verified against the originals, and a witness who is conveniently unable to appear." His voice was level and reasonable, the voice of a man addressing an obvious overreach with appropriate patience. "My family acted in good faith based on the information we had. What is being described as deliberate interference is, in fact, the Garrett family responding to a situation in which they themselves were deceived." "The copies are dated," Clara said. Robert Garrett looked at her. "The copies are dated and the handwriting is consistent throughout all 3 letters," she said. "I'd invite anyone on this board to read them against each other and make their own assessment of whether they were written by a woman fabricating an account after the fact or by a woman writing honest letters over a period of 3 months. She set the copies on the table in front of Walter Pruitt. "I'm not asking this board to punish anyone, I'm asking them to establish what actually happened. Because the story currently being told in this territory about me and my children is false, and I have 3 4-year-olds who are going to grow up in this community, and I intend for them to grow up in a community that knows the truth." The meeting went on for another 40 minutes. It was not neat, and it was not conclusive in the way that legal proceedings could be conclusive, because it was a town meeting rather than a court, and town meetings operated on the messier logic of community consensus rather than binding judgment. But by the time it was done, Walter Pruitt had moved that the board formally acknowledge that the circumstances of Mrs. Whitmore's arrival in Hollow Creek were disputed, and that the official community record should reflect the existence of contradicting accounts. Henry Cross seconded it. Dale Hicks, Robert Garrett's man on the board, voted against. The third remaining board member, a cautious man who had been visibly uncomfortable the entire meeting, voted in favor, apparently deciding that the cost of voting with the Garretts in this particular room on this particular day was higher than he wanted to pay. 3-1, with Robert Garrett's proxy against. It was not a victory in the absolute sense. It was a crack in a wall. Clara had built things from cracks before. The days that followed the meeting had a different quality than the days before it. Not easier exactly, but differently pressured, as if the nature of the problem had shifted. Before the meeting, the Garrett's primary weapon had been the story they were telling about Clara. After the meeting, that story had a publicly acknowledged counter-narrative, which meant it cost more to tell and carried less certainty with it. Robert Garrett did not stop. She had never expected him to stop. But the methods available to him had narrowed. He went after the Army contract anyway. He had a conversation with someone, not Aldridge, but someone above Aldridge, and pressure was applied in whatever form powerful men applied pressure through back channels. Colton found out about it on a Friday when a letter arrived from the fort saying that the February inspection was being postponed pending a review of supplier qualifications. He came inside with the letter and handed it to Clara without saying anything. She read it. She read it twice. She set it on the table. "The review process," she said. "How long does it take?" "Weeks, maybe longer, depending on who's conducting it." "Can you request an expedited review?" "I can request it. Whether it happens is another question." Clara looked at the letter. She thought about the February inspection that was now postponed. She thought about the spring foals and the feed costs and the ledger figures she had essentially memorized at this point. She thought about the specific way that powerful people conducted this kind of campaign, not through single decisive blows, but through accumulated friction, each individual obstacle small enough to seem possibly coincidental, the cumulative effect designed to exhaust rather than defeat. She thought about the town meeting and about Thomas Garrett standing up. "Thomas?" she said. Colton looked at her. "Thomas knew nothing about the letters," she said. "He said so publicly. If the Garretts are pursuing a review of your supplier qualifications based on claims about the integrity of our situation here, and Thomas has publicly stated that the situation they described is not what actually happened, Thomas has limited leverage over his own family," Colton said. "He has a different kind of leverage," Clara said. "He has the public statement he made in front of 40 people. If he were willing to put that in writing, a formal letter to whoever is conducting the review stating that the family's characterization of the situation has been contested and that he personally does not support any action against your contract based on those characterizations, he'd be going directly against his father. He already did that at the meeting." Colton was quiet. He turned the letter over in his hands. "I don't know if Thomas Garrett is that man," he said finally. "Standing up in a room full of neighbors is one thing. Writing a letter that his father will read is another." "I know," Clara said, "but I think someone should ask him." They looked at each other. Both of them understood who would have to ask. Clara drove to the Garrett property 2 days later, alone, which she knew would be noted and discussed and interpreted by everyone who saw her on the road. She went anyway. She had not come this far and fought this hard to be stopped by the fear of how things looked. Constance Garrett was the one who answered the door. It was the first time they had been in proximity since the platform, and the first time they had been face-to-face without a crowd. Constance looked at her with an expression that was controlled in the way of a woman who was excellent at controlling her expressions and did not care to hide the effort. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "you have considerable nerve." "I know," Clara said. "I'd like to speak with Thomas." "Thomas is not available." "I'll wait." Constance's eyes narrowed. "You will not—" "Mrs. Garrett," Clara kept her voice entirely level. "Your son told a room full of people that he didn't know about the letters. Whatever you believe about me, that was a true statement, and he made it publicly. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to ask him one question, and whether he answers it or not is his decision, not yours." Something moved behind Constance Garrett's eyes. Not softening, nothing like that, but a kind of adjustment, as if she was revising the category she'd placed Clara in. She had expected, Clara thought, that by now the situation would have resolved itself in the traditional manner. The person with less power would have exhausted themselves and gone away. That Clara was still here and was standing on her porch asking for access, with the calm manner of someone who had not exhausted herself at all, required a revision. Constance stepped back from the door. Thomas came down the hallway from somewhere in the back of the house a few minutes later. He looked at Clara with an expression that was complicated in the specific way of a man who knows he owes someone an apology and is not sure if saying it will make things better or worse. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "I need to ask you something," Clara said, "and I want you to think about it honestly, not in terms of what your father would want." Thomas Garrett looked briefly like a man who was being asked to use a muscle he hadn't exercised in a long time. Then he said, "All right." She told him about the review. She told him what she was asking for. She kept it specific and clean. Not a plea, not a performance of suffering, just the plain shape of the request and what it would require of him. He listened. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "My father will know I did it," he said. "Yes." "It won't. It might not even work. The review might go the way it's going to go regardless." "It might," she said, "but the letter would be in the official record, and you made a true statement in public 2 weeks ago. If you want that statement to mean something, this is what it costs." Thomas Garrett looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man who had been living inside a particular kind of cowardice for so long that he'd stopped noticing it as cowardice and had started to think of it as caution. "I'll write the letter," he said. Clara drove back to the ranch. She did not stop anywhere on the way. She went straight into the house, and Colton looked up from the stove and read her face and said, "He'll do it." "He'll do it," she confirmed. Colton turned back to the stove. After a moment he said, "That took something." "It took asking," Clara said. "You know what I mean." She did know what he meant. She set her coat on the hook and went to check on the children, who were in the bedroom with Biscuit conducting some kind of enterprise that involved several rocks and a piece of rope and the dog's profound cooperation. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching them. May looked up. "Mama," she said, in the tone she used for factual announcements, "Biscuit knows what a good rock sounds like." "Does she?" Clara said. "She does. She knocked this one with her nose." May held up a round, gray rock. "That means it's a good one." "That's good thinking," Clara said. She stood there another moment, and the exhaustion she'd been managing for weeks sat down somewhere inside her chest and simply rested for a moment, not gone, but briefly still. Owen Kane leaned against her leg without any particular reason, the way he did sometimes, just needing to be in contact with her, anchored. She put her hand on his head. "Are we staying?" he said. He hadn't been looking at her. He asked it in the casual tone that children used for questions that were not, in fact, casual at all. Clara thought about the review and the letter and the town meeting and the ledger and the February inspection and the spring foals and the army contract and everything that still hung unresolved in the air around them. "Yes," she said, "we're staying." Owen nodded, satisfied, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already decided for himself, and went back to the enterprise with the rope and the rocks. That evening, Agnes came by the ranch for the first time. She said she was passing on her way to the Darby place, which Clara suspected was not entirely true, but accepted as the polite fiction it was. She sat at the table with coffee and looked at Clara and Colton with the measuring expression she applied to most situations. "The review will take 3 weeks minimum," Agnes said. "I have that from a reliable source. 3 weeks gives you time, if Thomas's letter is received quickly." "He said he'd write it today," Clara said. Agnes looked at her. "You went to see Thomas Garrett." "I did." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's another matter." She set her coffee cup down. "People in this town are watching how this resolves itself. Not just because of the Garrett situation, because of you two." She looked at them both with the frank directness of a woman who had decided that clarity was more valuable than tact at this stage. What you are to each other matters, practically speaking. There are people who are willing to stand behind Clara's account of events and behind Colton's ranch, Because they believe this is a decent situation that was treated unjustly. If that belief starts to get complicated by questions about the nature of the arrangement, Agnes, Colton said. I'm not saying it to meddle, Agnes said. I'm saying it because Robert Garrett has not played his last hand, and one of the cards he still has is social standing. And social standing in this territory is not entirely separate from the question of what a man and a woman living on the same property are to each other when they are not married. The table was very quiet. She's not wrong, Clara said. Colton looked at her. She's not wrong about how it works, Clara said. And she's not wrong that it's a card Robert Garrett will play when he runs out of the other ones. She held his gaze. I'm not saying that to push anything. I'm saying it because you and I agreed to be honest with each other about the shape of the situation, and that's part of the shape. Colton was quiet for a long moment. Agnes drank her coffee and very carefully did not look at either of them. Clara, he said. He said it the way he had in the early days, with that slight additional weight that her first name carried when he used it. I want to be clear about something. All right. I'm not going to ask you to do something practical for a practical reason, he said. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that marriage would solve the legal situation and therefore it makes sense. You've had enough people make decisions about your life based on what's convenient for the situation. Clara looked at him. But I want you to know, he said, that the question is not one I haven't thought about, on my own account. Not because Agnes just raised it. He stopped. He looked at his coffee cup, then back at her, and she recognized the expression. It was the one he wore when he was saying something before he'd finished deciding whether to say it. I think you are the most capable and most difficult person I have ever met, and I think my ranch is better since you came, and I think the same thing about my life. He paused. That's all. I'm not asking anything. I just wanted to say it. The room was very quiet. Agnes put her cup down and said she had to be getting to the Darby place before dark. After she left, Clara sat with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and did not say anything for what was probably a full 2 minutes. Colton did not attempt to fill the silence, which she had come to understand was one of his most reliable qualities. I don't know yet, she said finally. I know, he said. Not because of the legal situation or Agnes's argument or anything practical. She stopped. She tried again. I have been in this house for 6 weeks. I have been making decisions at the speed that the situation required, and most of them have been the right decisions, and I've been doing it without time to think about anything beyond what the next problem required. Yes. And I would like to think about this one, she said, properly. Not because a review is pending or because someone laid out the social calculus of it. Take whatever time you need, Colton said. She looked at him. You're not going to be impatient? I've been patient about things my entire life, he said. I'm reasonably good at it. Clara looked at him a moment longer, and then she almost smiled. The real one this time, not the muscle memory of one. The actual thing, brief and unperformed. She turned back to her coffee before it fully resolved. Outside, the wind was doing what Wyoming wind did in January, which was remind you of its presence at regular intervals. The stove was warm, the children were asleep. Biscuit was in front of the stove in the position she always took, which was directly in the path of any traffic between the kitchen and the bedroom, because she had apparently decided that the best location was the most inconvenient one. Clara sat with Colton at the table in the lamplight, and they talked about the review and the horses, and what Frank Darby had said about the road to the fort, and what they needed to do in the next 10 days, and what they would do if the review went wrong, and what they would do if it didn't. They talked for a long time. Neither of them talked about the thing she was thinking about. But it was in the room with them, the way important things sometimes were. Not addressed, not avoided, just present, patient, waiting for the moment when there was room for it. She was not ready for that moment yet. But for the first time in 6 weeks, she thought that moment might actually come. Thomas Garrett's letter arrived at the fort on a Wednesday, which Clara knew because Agnes knew, and Agnes knew because Agnes had a way of knowing things that Clara had stopped questioning and simply accepted as one of the fixed features of the territory, like the mountains and the wind. The letter was 4 paragraphs. Thomas had written it in plain language without ornamentation. Clara read a copy that Agnes had somehow obtained, and she thought that the plainness of it was actually its strength, the way plain things often were. He stated that he had no knowledge of any deceptive conduct on Clara Whitmore's part. He stated that the correspondence between himself and Mrs. Whitmore had been managed by a third party without his full knowledge. He stated that any action against Colton Ward's supplier contract based on characterizations of Mrs. Whitmore's conduct should not be considered to have the support of Thomas Garrett personally, whatever position other members of his family might hold. He signed it with his full name and the date. It was not a dramatic letter. It did not accuse anyone of anything directly. But it was a letter written by a Garrett, and it said the opposite of what the other Garretts were saying, and in a territory where the Garrett name had functioned as a single unified instrument of influence for 2 decades, a crack in that instrument was a different kind of document than its content alone suggested. Colton read it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "His father is going to make his life difficult." "His father already makes his life difficult," Clara said. "Thomas has just decided to start noticing." The review, when it concluded 3 weeks later, found no grounds for disqualifying Colton's contract. The letter was in the official record. Captain Aldridge, who had told Colton off the record that he was uncomfortable with civilian interference in military procurement, had apparently made that discomfort known to whoever had initiated the review, because the conclusion came back faster than the minimum timeline Agnes had cited, and it came back clean. The February inspection was rescheduled for the last week of the month. Colton spent those intervening weeks doing what he'd been doing since December, which was working the horses with the same systematic daily attention that produced results slowly and then all at once. Clara watched the animals come into their condition. She had learned over these weeks to read what she was seeing in the barn, to understand the difference between a horse that was sound and one that was managing something, to recognize the particular quality of movement that meant an animal was genuinely right rather than performing rightness. Colton had taught her without making lessons of it, just by talking while he worked, narrating his observations in the way that people narrate things when they've forgotten that the other person doesn't already know what they know. Owen absorbed all this at approximately twice the rate Clara did, which she expected, because Owen at 4 years old had the specific learning style of a person who wanted to participate in things rather than observe them, and participation was a faster teacher than observation. The morning of the inspection, Owen woke before everyone and went to the barn and checked on each horse individually, which Colton discovered when he came down from the loft and found the barn door already open. He stood in the doorway and watched Owen move from stall to stall, talking quietly to each animal in the serious undertone he'd developed over weeks of watching Colton do the same thing, and then he went back inside and told Clara. Clara was at the stove. She listened to this and felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but lived in the complicated territory between them, where the things that matter most tend to make their home. "He's going to be good with horses," Colton said. "He's going to be good at whatever he decides to care about," Clara said. "That's how he is." They looked at each other over the distance of the kitchen, and then Clara turned back to the stove because the cornmeal was going to burn if she didn't, and Colton went to get his coat, and the morning proceeded the way mornings proceeded at the Three Bars Ranch, with work and noise and imperfect logistics, and the constant low hum of things that needed doing. Captain Aldridge came with 2 other men from the fort. They were there for most of the day. They examined each horse with the thorough, practiced attention of men who knew exactly what they were looking for and were not going to be influenced by anything other than what they found. Colton had 11 horses ready. He had pushed the conditioning hard in the final 2 weeks, and 4 of the mares had cooperated and the 7th had not. And the 11th horse was one he'd bought from Frank Darby in a transaction that had cost him more than he wanted to spend, but less than losing the contract would have. Clara kept the children in the house for most of the inspection, which was its own project. She cooked and mended and talked to May about rocks and refereed 2 disputes between Owen and Eli about the allocation of barn-related duties that were, in the broader sense, disputes about territory and fairness that would not be fully resolved for another decade or so. She watched through the window when she could. At the end of the afternoon, Aldridge came to the house. He took his hat off at the door, which Clara noticed as a deliberate gesture, the kind that meant something. 11 horses inspected and accepted, he said. "We'll take delivery of the remaining 9 in April as originally contracted, with the understanding that early delivery of these 11 is noted in the record as fulfillment in good faith." He looked at Colton. "The contract stands," Colton said. "Thank you." Aldridge looked at Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that acknowledged more than it stated. The letter, the review, the whole architecture of the thing. Then he put his hat back on and went. Clara stood in the doorway and watched the army men ride back down the road toward the fort. And she thought about the platform in December, and the $11 in her coat pocket, and the wagon ride to a ranch she'd never seen with a man she'd known for 40 minutes. She thought about all the moments between then and now that had required her to make a decision without enough information and commit to it anyway and live with the consequences. She was still living with them. She intended to keep doing so. 2 weeks after the inspection, on a morning in early March when the light had started to carry the faint suggestion of a different season, even though the cold was still entirely present, Clara made her decision. She had been thinking about it, as she'd told Colton she would, properly, and without the pressure of immediate crisis. She had thought about it while sewing in the evenings and while managing the children and while lying in the dark of the bedroom with 3 small people breathing around her and the particular quality of silence that comes when you are thinking about something important and you have finally given it enough space to show you its actual shape. The shape of it, when she could see it clearly, was this. She was not afraid of Colton Ward. She had been afraid of the situation, of dependency, of becoming an obligation, of replicating the vulnerability that had defined the worst years of her life. But the man himself, the man who filled the lamp and answered Owen's questions and told the truth at the fort, and said, "I want to build a life with you," without dressing it in anything softer than what it was, she was not afraid of him. She trusted him, not blindly, not without reservation, but in the specific and durable way that trust works when it's been tested by actual circumstances rather than projected onto idealized ones. That was not a small thing. In fact, it was the largest thing she had encountered in years. She told him after supper, after the children were in bed, in the same kitchen where they had been having the honest conversations that had held this whole improbable arrangement together from the beginning. "I've been thinking," she said. He looked up from the ledger. "About what you said, about what Agnes said, about what I said, which was that I needed time." She folded her hands on the table. "I've had the time." Colton set the pencil down. "I'm not saying yes because of the legal situation," she said. "Agnes's argument was correct, and I'm not pretending it wasn't, but that's not the reason. I'm saying yes because—" She stopped. She had rehearsed this part, and it had come out more structured in her head than it was coming out now, which was possibly a sign that the real version was truer than the rehearsed one. "Because you are honest with me even when honesty is inconvenient. Because you let me think and decide without running ahead of me. Because my children trust you, and my children are the best judges of character I have, and they have earned that position." She paused. "And because I trust you. Which is not something I say easily or that I have said to many people." Colton was very still. "So," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She expected him to say something. Colton usually thought before he spoke, but he usually spoke eventually. Instead, he reached across the table and covered both her folded hands with one of his, just briefly, the way you acknowledge something that doesn't need to be made larger than it already is. "All right," he said. "That's all you have to say?" "I've been thinking about what I'd say if you said yes for 6 weeks, he said. "Now that you've said it, everything I came up with sounds wrong." Clara looked at his hand on hers. "Then don't say anything," she said. "It doesn't need words." They were married 3 weeks later, on the last Saturday of March, in a small ceremony at the Hollow Creek Courthouse that took 20 minutes and was witnessed by Agnes Morrison and Frank Darby and Frank's daughter, who was 4 years old and took the occasion extremely seriously, and presented May with a handful of interesting pebbles as a gift, which May received with the gravity of someone being given something of genuine value. Owen cried, which surprised everyone, including Owen. He was not sad, he explained afterward, with the earnest, clarifying urgency of a child who needs you to understand the distinction. He was just very glad. Eli did not cry. He shook Colton's hand afterward with the formal solemnity of a person who had decided that this was the appropriate gesture and had practiced it in advance. Colton shook it back with equivalent seriousness, which Eli found satisfying. The Garrett family was not present. No one had expected them to be. Robert Garrett made 2 more moves in the months that followed, because Robert Garrett was not a man who conceded positions he'd occupied. He had a conversation with the county land assessor that resulted in a reassessment of the 3 bars property that was probably not coincidental. He also circulated, through indirect channels, a version of the Whitmore situation that had been revised to account for the public record. It was subtler now, not accusation of deception, but implication of imprudence. The suggestion that whatever had happened with the letters A woman who moved into a single man's house with 3 children and then married him inside of 4 months was a woman of questionable judgment. Clara heard this version of herself around town occasionally, in the slight hesitations of people deciding how to greet her, in the quality of silence that followed certain introductions. It bothered her less than she would have expected. Not because it didn't sting, because it did, but because she had learned something over these months about the relationship between what people said about you and what was actually true about you, which was that the connection between the two was a great deal more tenuous than most people admitted. What was true about her was what she did every day. That was the only record that mattered over time. She kept doing it. The spring came. Wyoming springs came, reluctantly, with setbacks. Nothing like the soft and gradual unfolding that spring suggested in other parts of the world. There were 3 more hard freezes after the crocuses came up, and 1 late storm that took down a section of fence and kept Colton outside for 2 days in conditions that were not forgiving, and a period in April when 2 of the mares had complications with their foals that cost them several nights of sleep and 1 animal that didn't make it, which was the hard reality of a breeding operation that no one who worked one talked about easily. But the foals that did come were good. Colton had known his mares and known his stallion, and the results, when they were healthy, confirmed what he'd believed about the breeding program. By May, he had 7 foals, 5 of which met Army specifications, which combined with the remaining 9 he owed from the original contract gave him a position for the fall that was stronger than anything in the ledger had suggested was possible in December. Clara's sewing work had grown, which she had not entirely planned, but recognized as something she should not turn away from. She had taken on a 4th commission, then a 5th, then started doing alterations for the dry goods store directly, which Agnes had proposed with the characteristic directness of a woman who sees an efficiency and implements it without sentiment. The money was modest but steady, and steady money was a different kind of security than occasional money, and Clara understood the difference viscerally. She also started keeping the 3 Bars books properly, not because Colton had asked her to, but because she had been in his ledger enough times that she had views about its organization. And one evening she had simply said so, and Colton had looked at the ledger and then at her and said, "Then organize it," with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who knows when someone else is more suited to a task than he is. She reorganized it. She implemented a system that tracked the horses individually, their feeding costs, their conditioning schedule, their projected sale price, so that the profitability of each animal was visible rather than estimated. She tracked the sewing income separately. She built a picture of where they were and where they were going that was more detailed than what Colton had maintained, not because he was careless, but because he was one person managing too many things, and a second person with a clear eye changed what was possible. The picture by early summer was not comfortable, but it was no longer precarious in the way it had been in December, when one wrong move could have unraveled everything. It was tight and honest and showed exactly where the pressure was and where there was room. That was, Clara thought, the best you could say about most situations that were genuinely being managed. Not that they were resolved, but that you could see them clearly. In June, Agnes told them that Robert Garrett had developed a problem with one of his largest creditors, a bank in Cheyenne that had financed a significant land acquisition the previous year and was now requesting accelerated repayment on terms that Robert had apparently not anticipated. The details were not entirely clear because financial dealings at that level moved through channels that were not transparent to territory gossip, but the broad shape was visible. The Garrett operation, which had appeared monolithic for so long, had taken on debt during a period of expansion and was now discovering that debt had its own opinions about timing. "He overextended," Clara said when Agnes told her. "He's been doing it for years," Agnes said. "He's been doing it because nobody in this territory pushed back on him, so he never had a reason to be careful. When you have no resistance, you start to believe you don't need to account for risk." Clara thought about this. She thought about December and about what would have happened if she had gotten back on that train. Not just to herself and her children, that was its own accounting, but to this territory, to the small ranches and the neighbors and the people who had been living under the shadow of Garrett, certainty for so long that they'd stopped imagining an alternative. She had not come here to challenge anyone. She had come here to survive. But sometimes surviving in a place changes the place, and you don't always know in advance which of those things is going to matter more. Thomas Garrett came to see them in July. He came alone without announcement on a Tuesday afternoon when Colton was in the barn, and Clara was in the yard with the children. He pulled his horse up at the gate and sat there for a moment, apparently working something out, before he dismounted. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at the children. Owen and Eli were in the process of constructing something at the far end of the yard that involved sticks and rope and a level of structural ambition that probably exceeded their engineering ability. May was sitting near the fence examining a rock she had found in the road and appeared to consider significant. "They look settled," Thomas said. "They are," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "I moved out of the main house," he said, 2 weeks ago. "I'm staying at the Darby Ranch temporarily while I figure out my next step." He paused. "I have some money. Not as much as my father would like me to think, but some. I'm thinking about starting a smaller operation. Cattle, probably. Something that's mine." "That sounds right," Clara said. He looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the platform. For not saying anything when my mother—" He stopped. "I should have said something." Clara looked at him for a long moment. This was a thing she had thought about more than once over the months, not with the energy of active grievance, which she could not afford and did not want to maintain, but with the quiet, uncomfortable honesty of someone trying to understand how things happen. How a man who was not deliberately cruel could stand on a platform and say nothing, while a woman and 3 children were publicly dismantled. How silence could do the same damage as speech, and leave the person who kept silent feeling like they hadn't quite done anything wrong. "You were living inside a way of things that had been true your whole life," she said. "That doesn't excuse it, but I understand it." Thomas looked like someone who was not sure they deserved that much. "I wrote the letter," he said, "not because you asked. I want to be clear. I'd been thinking about it before you came to see me. You coming just made it easier to decide." "I know," Clara said. "It was a good letter." He nodded. He looked around the yard and the house and the barn with the expression of someone doing a kind of accounting. "You've done something here," he said. It was not exactly a compliment, and it was not exactly an observation. It was more like a recognition, the acknowledgement of something he was seeing for the first time clearly. "We're still doing it," Clara said. He left an hour later, after coffee and a conversation with Colton in the barn that she was not part of and did not ask about afterward. She saw them shake hands at the barn door. She noted it and let it be. That evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, Clara and Colton sat on the porch in the long summer light that Wyoming saved up all winter and deployed generously in July. It was warm enough to sit outside without a coat, which was still a thing she appreciated in the specific way of someone who spent December on a frozen platform with 3 children and had a particular relationship with warmth as a concept. Biscuit was at the edge of the porch, watching the yard with the authority of someone who has assessed the territory and found it adequate. "He's going to be all right," Colton said. He meant Thomas. "Probably," Clara said. "He has to decide what kind of man he wants to be now that he's not being told. That takes some people a while." "It took me a while," Colton said. She looked at him. "I spent a long time on this ranch just managing," he said. "Keeping things going, not falling behind, not getting ahead either, just not falling behind." He looked at the barn. "I told myself that was enough, that a man who kept his own operation running and minded his own business was doing what was required." He paused. "I watched the Garretts do things over the years that I knew were wrong, to other people. I minded my business." "You didn't mind your business in December," Clara said. "No," he said, "I didn't." "What was different?" He thought about it, the way he always thought about things. Actually, not as a performance of thinking. "You," he said finally. "Which sounds simple, but isn't. I'd seen other people in hard situations. I'd looked away before. But I watched you take your coat off and give it to those kids, and there was something about it." He stopped. "It wasn't that it was dramatic. It was that it wasn't. You weren't performing anything. You just did the thing that needed to be done without making a decision out of it." Clara looked at the yard. May's rock collection had migrated to a corner of the porch and was arranged in rows that reflected some organizational principle that was probably clear to May. "I was terrified," Clara said, "in case that wasn't apparent." "It wasn't apparent," he said. "Good," she said. "I worked hard at that." They sat for a while in the long evening light. The horses made sounds in the barn. Owen's voice came faintly from inside, talking in his sleep the way he did, which was something he'd always done, and which Clara had stopped finding alarming and had started finding simply characteristic. Owen had things to process, and he processed them at all hours. Clara thought about what it meant that she was sitting on this porch in July, when in December she had been standing on a platform with nowhere to go. She thought about what the distance between those two moments was actually made of. Not luck, not rescue, but the accumulation of decisions, most of them unglamorous, most of them made without enough information, most of them made anyway. The decision to hand a stranger her honesty in a letter. The decision not to get on the train. The decision to take the blanket. The decision to go to Agnes. The decision to go to Thomas. The decision to say yes to the question that mattered most. And Colton's decisions too, which ran alongside hers like a parallel accounting. The decision to cross the platform, to offer the blanket, to make the offer he hadn't fully thought through before he made it, to go to the fort, to say what he'd said at the table that night with Agnes present, to wait. It was not a story about being saved. That was the thing she wanted to understand clearly, and she did understand it, sitting on this porch in the July light. She had not been rescued. She had been given a choice at the right moment by a person who was willing to bear the cost of offering it. That was different. The choosing was hers. The building was hers and Colton's together. The life they were making was not the result of one person's goodness toward another. It was the result of two people deciding, separately and then together, to do the harder thing when the easier thing was available. She had known women who waited their whole lives to be saved. She had been close to being one of them in the dark months after Daniel died, when it had seemed like the only currency she had was need. What she had learned, what this year had demonstrated in terms she could not ignore, was that need alone did not protect you. Need made you vulnerable to whoever decided to define the terms of your rescue. The only protection was agency, even imperfect agency, even agency exercised with $11 and a worn dress and 3 4-year-olds in a Wyoming winter. You had to keep choosing, even when the choices were bad and the information was incomplete and the ground was uncertain. You had to keep choosing, because the alternative was to let someone else do it, and the people who did it for you always had their own reasons. The Garretts are going to pull through their debt problem, Colton said. He had been looking at the mountains. Robert Garrett has been running that operation for 30 years. He'll find the money somewhere. Probably, Clara said. So they're not going away. They're not going away, she agreed. That bother you? She thought about it honestly. Less than it did, she said. They were bigger in December because we were smaller. That's changed. She paused. And Robert Garrett has a problem that no amount of land or money is going to solve for him. What's that? Thomas, she said simply. Colton considered this. One son, he said. One son who moved out of the main house, she said. One son who wrote a letter. One son who is starting his own operation. She looked at the mountains that the Garretts did not own, that nobody owned, that the Wyoming sky sat above with complete indifference to the arrangements of men below. An empire that only one person can inherit is only as secure as that person's willingness to inherit it on the intended terms. Robert Garrett has spent 30 years building something, and the person he built it for has started building something else. Colton nodded slowly. That's a cold comfort for Robert. Yes, Clara said, but it's not meant to be a comfort for Robert. They sat until the light finally gave out, which took longer in July than you expected, the sun reluctant to finish even after it had clearly started. Then they went inside, checked the children, Owen still narrating to himself in sleep, Eli sprawled across 2/3 of the bed with the specific territorial authority of a child who has assessed the available space and claimed it, May with one hand curved around her best rock. And they went to their room, which had been the storage room that first night, and was different now in all the ways that a space changes when it belongs to a life rather than a contingency. The life was not easy. Clara did not expect it to become easy. The ranch required work that was unending and seasonal and vulnerable to weather and animal behavior and market forces, and the ongoing complexity of Robert Garrett's existence in the same territory. The sewing brought in money that helped, but was not sufficient alone. The children were 4, then 5, then would be 6, requiring the specific and exhausting and irreplaceable work of raising people from the beginning, not shaping them, not directing them, but providing them with enough stability and enough truth that they could shape themselves into whoever they were going to be. Owen, who had the horses. Eli, who had the numbers, who had, at 5, started looking at the ledger with the kind of focused attention that meant something, that meant a particular mind encountering its natural territory. May, who had the rocks, which were not really about rocks at all, but about the instinct to look closely at things, to categorize and evaluate and honor the particular qualities of specific things in a world that tended to generalize. 3 children who had arrived at a frozen station with nothing but their mother's determination and had ended up in a place that was theirs. Not perfect, not finished, not without the ongoing difficulties that are the actual texture of a real life. But theirs. Clara thought sometimes about the version of herself that had almost gotten back on that train. She thought about her on that bench, doing the math of $11 against 3 children in a Wyoming winter, running the calculation toward the only answer that seemed to have any logic, which was, go back. There is nothing here for you. Go back. She thought about what it would have cost to be that woman. Not the financial cost, not the practical cost, but the cost to some deeper part of herself that had not been willing, in the end, to accept that the sum of a person's worth could be calculated by a woman like Constance Garrett, pointing a gloved finger in a public space. She had not gotten on the train. That was the beginning of everything. Not because staying led automatically to anything good. It could have led to more disaster, and she had understood that when she made the choice. But because staying was an assertion, it was a refusal to allow someone else's judgment of her circumstances to become the last word about her life. And that refusal, sustained through months of unglamorous and incremental work, had become something she had not dared to name in December. A home. Not a perfect one, not a resolved one, but one that was entirely, unmistakably hers. She had been rejected by people who looked at what she had and decided it wasn't worth their time. She had been chosen by a man who looked at the same things and decided differently. But the more important choosing, the one that made everything else possible, was the one she had done herself, on a platform in December, in the cold, with 3 frightened children and $11 and a worn gray dress and no clear idea of what came next. She had chosen to stay. Everything after that was the consequence of that choice, built one unglamorous day at a time by 2 imperfect people who had decided to build it together. On the Wyoming frontier, that was enough. That was, in the end, everything.